Hello, my name is Shivani Garg Patel, and I am Chief Strategy Officer at the Skoll Foundation. I am excited to welcome you to this debate at the Skoll World Forum. Can capitalism truly be inclusive? This year, the forum's theme is Closing the Distance, and we thought there was no better way to reflect that theme than to invite our global network to design and build a new kind of event together. And we are so thrilled to be able to include this session in this year's virtual Skoll World Forum, and would like to extend a special thank you to Acumen and EY for proposing and designing this thought-provoking debate. Before we get to it, I'll share a few quick logistical items. The session is being recorded. Please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and ask questions of the speakers. The session is scheduled to end in 60 minutes. So once the session ends, please take a few minutes to complete the survey in the poll tab to the right of the hop-in video screen. And on social media, we're using the hashtag SkollWF, and we'd love for you to do the same. At the Skoll Foundation, we are really excited about this topic because we think about social innovations that drive to a more inclusive economic system that centers on economic dignity and advancement for all communities. And in this work, we inevitably come to an inclusive or stakeholder-based capitalism as a vehicle to that aim. Yet we grapple with this. Is capitalism inherently limited in its ability to be inclusive? And do we have to consider entirely new or different models for a future economic system that lifts up more people? With that, I'd like to hand off to Yasmina Zaidman.
It is such a pleasure to be a part of this year's Skoll World Forum, and while I truly miss the warmth and camaraderie of the in-person event in Oxford, I'm so glad that these discussions can happen despite all the challenges of the pandemic. And I really want to thank everyone for joining not only the forum, but this particular debate. It should be fun and interesting. Acumen and EY have been partners for 7 years. We were brought together by a shared commitment to investing in and empowering entrepreneurs that are tackling the world's most pressing problems. The Acumen Debates series is a long-term collaboration with EY, and it aims to ignite discussions on issues that are pertinent to the global social impact community. Since we launched it, Acumen and EY have hosted 5 such debates on things like the role of government, financial and social impact trade-offs, and other really critical topics for our field. We chose the debate topic so that we could discuss the nuances of capitalism, especially as we hear more about stakeholder capitalism and inclusive capitalism. It's easy for us to say that we believe in inclusive capitalism, but can we really push ourselves to discuss the potential shortcomings, alternative approaches to advancing equity, and what inclusive capitalism really means? One of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is that Acumen and EY have both been asking ourselves this question. When Acumen started 20 years ago, we were really confident that market forces could solve the problems of poverty, but we've learned over time how critical it is to use investment as a means and not an end. So Acumen and EY together, based on our respective experiences working with hundreds of entrepreneurs that are building inclusive businesses, wanted to explore this topic in depth, to learn together and then share what we learned with others. So we're going to be publishing a playbook in the next few weeks that really digs into some of what we learned, what we saw, and examples of inclusive businesses, the principles that they operate by. You'll hear more about this from my collaborator, Jessie Coates, who has been an amazing partner to us from EY. She is also the moderator for today's session, so I will happily hand it over to her, and I look forward to seeing all of you later in the debate.
Thank you, Yasmina. I'm Jessie Coates, as Yasmina shared, the Global Impact Entrepreneurship Leader at EY, and it's my privilege to be moderating a debate on as big and as important a topic as this one today, with such an esteemed group of speakers. Our debate, as you know, centres on inclusive capitalism, an economic system that fundamentally underpins the entire concept of social entrepreneurship, of impact investing, and of business as a force for good. The Oxford English Dictionary defines capitalism as an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. And by definition, inclusive capitalism seeks to apply the principles of private ownership and that profit motive in a way that benefits all stakeholders. Indeed, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, led by a core group of business leaders and organizations representing over $10 trillion in assets under management and 200 million workers, considers that inclusive capitalism is fundamentally about creating long-term value for all stakeholders, businesses, investors, employees, customers, governments, and communities. But we're not debating here today what inclusive capitalism is, nor are we debating how inclusive capitalism can be implemented or by whom. Today, we're debating something far more fundamental, whether it even exists at all. The motion up for debate at this 2021 Skoll World Forum is, there is no such thing as inclusive capitalism. Capitalism inherently intensifies inequity and exploitation. As always, as Yasmina shared, the aim of these Acumen debates in collaboration with EY is to ignite a vigorous debate amongst friends on issues of critical importance to the social impact community. And so I would ask that we all employ Chatham House rules, because the views expressed in this forum may well not be the views of the wider organizations that the speakers represent, and may be extreme versions of those views for the sake of argument. The debate format will be simple. First, we'll ask you, the audience, to vote up front for whether you stand for or against the motion. So begin thinking now. We'll then have 2 rounds of debate. First, one speaker for and one speaker against the motion will go head to head, and then another 2 speakers will take up the mantle to argue their respective sides. And we'll then open up the debate to pose questions from the audience to the speakers. We likely won't be able to pose every single question to the speakers, so please do consider your questions carefully and make it clear if you're posing it to a specific speaker in response to one of their arguments. And finally, we'll close the debate by asking you to vote again whether you still stand for or against the motion based on what you've heard today. So with no further ado, we'll jump straight into the first item. Do you, the audience, stand for or against the motion, there is no such thing as inclusive capitalism? Capitalism inherently intensifies inequity and exploitation. To vote, please navigate to slido.com in your browser on either your phone or in another window on your computer and enter the code you see on your screen to cast your all-important vote. And while you're doing that, I'm honored to introduce our 4 fantastically passionate, thoughtful, articulate, and brave practitioners of the topic, representing between them corporations, investors, governments, and nonprofits. To argue for the motion, I'm joined by Laleh Ishbahani, Managing Director of the grant-making network Open Society Foundations. Laleh supports the Executive Director of US Programs with administration of the 70-person program, and she also leads a team that develops strategies aimed at ensuring a more inclusive and accountable democracy. Laleh is a renowned lawyer and advocate specializing in democracy and human rights issues, has produced a documentary film, Democracy's Ghosts, and is published in academic and popular journals. Arguing alongside her is Juan Maciera, Chief Advisor to the Mayor of the City of Buenos Aires and previously President of the Housing Institute of the City of Buenos Aires. And in that role, Maciera has made the upgrading of slums a priority and is doing it with an innovative bottom-up approach. And Juan was recently selected as one of the world's 100 most influential young people in government. To argue against the motion, I'm joined by Parag Mehta, Executive Director and Senior Vice President of the Center of Inclusive Growth, the philanthropic hub of the global payments corporation, MasterCard. Parag leads the team dedicated to ensuring the benefits of economic growth are broadly shared and who work to leverage the core competencies and assets of MasterCard to achieve the same. Prior to joining MasterCard, Parag served as the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the 19th Surgeon General of the United States. And last, but certainly not least, arguing alongside him is Yasmina Zaidman, Chief Partnerships Officer of Acumen, who you've already met. And Yasmina leads Acumen's efforts to engage with corporate partners and institutions that share Acumen's commitment to tackling poverty. She's worked in international development, corporate sustainability, and social entrepreneurship for 25 years, and during that time has spearheaded Acumen's gender integration work and initiated the $22 million Pioneer Energy Investment Initiative. So before I turn over the debate to Lale, Juan, Parag, and Yasmina, I think it's time to review the response from the audience, which is 68% agree with the motion and 32% disagree. So let's see if the speakers can change your perspective and swing some votes in the next 50 minutes. In this first round of the debate, Lale Ishbahani will set out her arguments for the motion for around 5 minutes. Parag Mehta will set out his arguments against the motion, and then we'll have a few minutes of rebuttal. And as a reminder, the debate motion is there is no such thing as inclusive capitalism. Capitalism inherently intensifies inequity and exploitation.
Thank you. The question to me really isn't whether market-based strategies can help alleviate poverty. They can, and they have. The question is whether inclusive capitalism can by itself address rising inequality. And I would say it can't. Let's be honest, inequality has accelerated even in periods of rising tides lifting all boats, socially responsible business practices, and now stakeholder or inclusive capitalism. Let's take 3 crises to show why capitalism alone can't repair inequality. I'll focus on US examples, but they really do apply elsewhere. Let's first take wages. 40 years ago, President Reagan promised a rising tide to lift all boats, but in fact, wages have declined since, and inequality widened. Despite record productivity, millions of Americans work for just over $7 an hour. Take Keisha, who works for $7.25 in a fast food restaurant. She's no teenager earning a training wage. She's worked in fast food for decades, and now her 22-year-old son does so as well. Even living together and combining earnings, they can't make ends meet. When they're sick, there's no doctor, no paid sick days. Even pre-pandemic, 40% of American adults weren't paid enough to meet their basic needs. And at the same time, 350 of our large corporations pay their CEOs 278 times what they pay their workers. And 24 companies have CEO to worker pay gaps of 1,000 to 1. America's richest 1% own as much wealth as its entire middle class. And the tipped minimum wage, that remains only just above $2. Why? Because of the lobbying and political power of the Restaurant Association. California now requires all workers to receive the full minimum wage, and the restaurant industry has adapted. Inclusive capitalism did not lift these Californians out of poverty. It was social pressure, policy, and political will. This isn't just a reflection of corporate capture of our legislative process. It's the logical conclusion that capitalism promotes. If a company can pay someone less for the same work, the market tells it to do so to maximize profit. The profit motive encourages exploitation. The ROI from lobbying dollars far exceeds the ROI on research and development. So capitalism effectively dictates engagement in the political process and rigs rules to benefit capital over workers. Worse yet, capitalism morally launders rising inequality as reflective of someone's worth. Which brings me to racism. My second point, it's well documented that workers of color earn less and have less access to economic opportunity. The relationship between capitalism and racism runs deep. As detailed in the brilliant report 1619, America's competitive advantage has been based on slave labor forever. And capitalism continues to encourage human exploitation. Look at the lack of wealth and even wealth building opportunities in communities of color. Latino workers earn 20% less than the national median, and Latino factory workers are paid less for the same work. Black households whose home ownerships are nearly 30-year lows not only have even lower incomes, but also significantly lower family wealth, completely stifling their children's options and futures. Finally, my third point, let's look at corporate consolidation. As we learned in Econ 101, true laissez-faire capitalism is self-defeating. It creates a tendency to monopoly, as well as a tendency to accelerate extinction, with scarcity producing rising value. Today, there's a consolidation of market share and profit in almost every sector of our economy, especially in technology. Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google are worth $2.4 trillion, roughly the GDP of France. This explains an economy in which 10% of companies now accumulate 80% of the profit. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos grew $70 billion wealthier as his business model exploded during the pandemic. Yes, Amazon provides services we want, But Bezos could give every one of his workers a $100,000 bonus and still be as wealthy as he was pre-pandemic. To the workers who made his growth possible while working 55-hour weeks and exposed to COVID in closed warehouses. If inclusive capitalism were really up to the task of restoring America's middle class, Amazon workers would be paid twice as much and would not turn over at an annual rate of 100%. In closing, remember Keisha's poverty wages, the Latino worker making less for the same work, and Bezos underpaying warehouse workers. What we have today is a low road or winner-take-all version of capitalism, one of stunning disparities in need of serious repair. And that repair will require social pressure, political will, and policy, with the market helping potentially on the back end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lale, for some very powerful and evidenced arguments around the role that capitalism is playing in exacerbating income inequality, as you talked about, particularly visible over the last year through the COVID-19 pandemic, and at a minimum, facilitating the persistence of racism. Parag, you're a representative of a multinational corporation, so I imagine you might have a slightly more favorable view of capitalism. You're arguing in opposition to Lale against the motion. Parag, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Clearly, Yasmina and I have our work cut out for us based on the audience poll, so let's do our best here. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Parag Mehta. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Growth. We are the philanthropic arm of MasterCard, and we seek to advance inclusive economic growth and broadly shared prosperity around the world. So this topic is of particular importance to us because this is the kind of capitalism and the kind of economic growth we want to see in all parts of the world. I want to start by saying that 21 years ago, I was a graduate student at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. I was pursuing my master's degree in public administration because I wanted to work in government. I believe that government was the most important force for good in our world because it brought us all together regardless of our differences or our motives. But what was interesting to me about that program is that the MPA students who studied public administration took almost the exact same curriculum and classes as the MBA students, the business administration students. We took statistics and organizational leadership. We took budgeting and macroeconomics together. It was only in our final semester where we split apart, where the business students focused on a profit motive and where the public affairs students focused on a social impact motive. And so it makes me think that we have much more in common across sectors than what divides us. For years, I worked in government and political campaigns, and I would get invited to events like this, where I'd hear corporate executives talking about, can capitalism be salvaged? Doing the navel gazing, asking, can capitalism be good again? And I used to roll my eyes and think, well, you're the ones who shape it. So rather than opining on it, take the actions to do it. And now here I am as a representative of a global company having the same conversation because what I recognize is that this has to be done by design. We can't just will it into existence. Inclusive capitalism is something that we all collectively create. We have to begin by acknowledging that capitalism is not uniform. There are different types and adaptations, whether it's in China or in India, in European countries, or here in the United States. But about 80% of the world's economic output comes from some sort of capitalistic system, which means that overall, capitalism is winning out. People are choosing capitalism. I have to say, I have some concerns with putting the adjectives in front of capitalism, like inclusive capitalism. It's almost as if we need to qualify whether capitalism is a positive or negative. It's an economic system, people. Whether it's a force for good or evil is up to us, to the people who shape both the public and the private sectors. And speaking of sectors, I'm increasingly starting to believe that these are artificial constructs that may have outlived their usefulness, because the frame now serves more to divide than it does to clarify or enlighten. While it's completely fair to say that the public sector and the private sector are motivated by different forces, when it comes to building a functional and inclusive society, businesses and governments have far more in common than they have in difference. For example, governments ultimately survive by the will of the governed. Whether it's a democracy or an autocracy, policy is ultimately driven by some sort of shareholder interest and consumer choice. Those are market forces. And on the side of business, well, we exist to do more than just make profits for our shareholders, for our owners, and our employees. We have both a moral and an existential imperative to work for the betterment of society. After all, business cannot succeed in a failing world. I will say that capitalism has done pretty well to lift people out of poverty. But the question should not be how much do we have? It should be how do we conduct ourselves? Capitalism needs guardrails. And every system, when left unfettered, will run into problems. So capitalism needs guardrails because it is not inherently a creator of inequity and exploitation, nor is it doing enough to address these challenges. But here's the important thing. Capitalism could be an effective system which will create broadly shared prosperity and inclusive economic growth. We have to choose to do so. Systems like capitalism are neither inclusive or exclusive by default. It's not an inherent quality of capitalism, rather they are design systems. And what matters very much is the designers. We, the people, the voters, the shareholders, the workers, the executives, and the elected leaders, we're the designers. We get to choose every day and with every decision we make how inclusive our capitalism will be. I spent years working in the US Department of Labor at a regulatory agency that governed federal contractors and incentivized them to be good employers, to diversify their workforce, to hire women and minorities, to take affirmative action to make sure that their workforces reflected the beauty of the country. We were often told that the danger in that was that businesses would choose not to do business with the federal government if they were overregulated. But in my entire time in government, I never heard of one single business that wanted to turn down a lucrative government contract because they weren't willing to meet the obligations they had to participate. Look, we need both carrots and sticks to incentivize good behaviors and to hold businesses accountable for bad behaviors. And we need new models of commercially sustainable social impact that incentivize businesses to do what we at MasterCard have been doing. Look at your long-term interests, not just your immediate market forces. We also need a regulatory resource by the government that empowers our governments to hold the private sector actors accountable without stifling innovation and growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Parag, for that really interesting journey through your own career history as well. And I guess kind of what I would take from that as one point that perhaps, Lale, I'll turn back to you to see if you have any riposte, this concept that exclusion is not an inherent quality of capitalism, rather something that is a design in our current system. Lale, do you have any challenge to Parag on that? Because it's quite at odds with some of the evidenced arguments you put forward, or indeed on any other comments you have on Parag's statements.
I don't disagree with most of what Parag said. I do think, though, that heavy regulation is in order. I don't think the market naturally provides solutions. If it did, the private sector car industry would have created seatbelts a long time ago, and market dynamics would have ensured competition, drove them to improve them. No, that didn't happen. That didn't happen without legislation. You can think of many other examples. So I do agree that you have to do it by design, but even within the ESG or stakeholder capitalism community, there are disagreements, right? There's a Larry Fink version where he's really getting companies to focus on ESG from an investor point of view, and then there's a Tim Cook version of it that says corporations should be less investor and more value focused and think of it with a longer term lens, which is aligned to well-being. And that still seems to be sort of more of a minority view. And I don't think it's fair to say that businesses go along with the greater good at all times. They do fight regulation tooth and nail. And Parag, you know that from your days in the Obama administration. So I do think I think we can even see with the development of the vaccine, there was something like $24 billion invested in R&D that got us to the place of developing vaccines, but we don't have a people's vaccine. And we don't have a people's vaccine because the corporations aren't actually putting the public health and public interest first. So agreed that they could be more done by design, agreed that regulation is super important, but we do need policy, we need to regulate, we need reform, and we need to address the failures of the market because they are there.
Fantastic. A fantastic response, Lale. And Parag, maybe before we move to the second round of speakers, anything you wanted to share just in response to that rebuttal?
Yeah, I have tremendous respect for Lale, and she makes some very important arguments. I want to address a few of them. First, she says that by itself, capitalism can't lead to inclusion. And of course, I agree with that. None of this is about doing it by ourselves. It has to be a partnership, not only between government and the private sector, but also the support of the nonprofit and the academic sectors. Lale, you focused on Ronald Reagan and the decline in wages, and I couldn't agree more that over the past 40 years, we have seen a stagnation of wages. I would argue that that was more a failure of government to protect labor unions, regulate companies, and pass laws to either increase the minimum wage or to establish a living wage. But when people ask me, can you cite an example of an inclusive capitalist society? The answer is right here at home. the United States. In the 1950s and 60s, we were a more inclusive capitalist society with rising wages and more shared prosperity. What we didn't address in those decades was the racism and the barriers that left hundreds and millions of people out of the system. So that goes to Lale's second point about racism. Look, racism is not unique to capitalist societies. You can find racism in communist and socialist societies as well. The reckoning over racial and economic justice that happened over the last year, particularly in the United States, but also in parts of Europe and Australia, is further proof that democratic participation and shareholder capitalism go hand in glove. The reason why companies must speak out against the legislation in Georgia that's preventing people from being able to vote is because our destiny and our accountability is tied to the people exercising their democratic right to vote. That is why MasterCard is standing in solidarity with Black-owned and Black-led small businesses and taking tangible steps to make sure that more of our business goes to those Black communities. And finally, if you don't like consolidation, then you have to support competition and free markets. That's capitalism. Why did Amazon workers, warehouse workers in Alabama choose not to unionize? It's not because they don't like that Jeff Bezos is making record-breaking profits. It's that they want to someday be able to be in a position to make that kind of profit themselves. We shouldn't limit the potential of the worker. We should absolutely support the rights and the collective power of workers organizing.
Fantastic, Parag. And Lale, I'm sure you have lots of commentary to come back on, but in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on to the second round of speakers, and we're going to mix up the order a bit. First, Yasmina will argue against the motion, building on that incredibly passionate response, Parag. And then Juan Maciera will argue for the motion. And again, we'll have a few minutes of rebuttal before we open up to audience Q&A. So keep your questions coming. Yasmina, you've had the benefit of listening to the debate thus far. Please do set out your arguments to build on Parag's perspective.
Absolutely, and thank you, Jesse. And my head is spinning. There's so many important and diverse views that I'm processing. But I want to argue against the motion because I believe that there is such a thing as inclusive capitalism, and that capitalism does not inherently intensify inequity and exploitation. I've dedicated my career to this possibility, and I see more and more signs every day that capitalism can transition through the kinds of partnerships and innovations that Parag referred to. So I want to get into 3 reasons why I disagree with the motion, despite the challenges of traditional capitalism that we've talked about. First, we've seen so many cases, particularly in the developing world, where governments have failed to get products and services to millions of low-income people in any kind of scalable or sustainable way. Currently, 790 million people lack access to energy for basic household needs, and the same number lack access to an improved water supply. So in an ideal world, governments would be able to address the needs of the most vulnerable, but in many countries, they lack the resources or political will to do so. And inclusive businesses can often play a vital role in addressing those gaps. So I want to talk about some examples because I think it helps bring to life why some of us are so persuaded by this possibility. One is Easy Solar in Sierra Leone. Their mission is to make energy, financial services, and life-improving products affordable and accessible to all. Today in Sierra Leone, only 11% of their 7 million people have access to electricity. So what this means is there's been a failure obviously of markets, but also of the government to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. So Easy Solar comes along and says, we think we can come up with a solution to this, putting people and the environment at the center. They have brought a transformative business model that has reached 400,000 people in just 5 years, and it's created over 500 clean energy jobs. They are excited to work with the government. They're excited to scale this. And the government has essentially not gotten in their way, making it possible for them to access the capital, to engage with them so that they could provide these services. Another great example, I think, is in Ghana around the waste management issue. Ghana produces more than 20,000 tons of plastic waste each year, and they're only able to recycle 2% of that through their formal infrastructure. So this is a business that is designed to address that huge challenge that leads to flooding and environmental challenges that impact, as always, the poorest, but also to create dignified and safe work to help low-income people, primarily women, and they employ over 230 people to collect waste in a way that's safe and to progress in their careers, even starting their own micro businesses. The founder of this company is what you would call a justice capitalist. He believes that this business can solve a problem, can create profits, and can improve the lives of the most vulnerable. This is showing a path forward that governments could embrace, but it wouldn't have started with just government policy alone. The second reason I believe that inclusive capitalism must exist is that markets can be a really effective listening tool, particularly for people who are marginalized. So while it's important for everyone to have the opportunity to participate in democracy and to have their voice heard, the reality is that most marginalized people engage with markets every single day, often multiple times. And this can be a way for them to voice their preferences and their needs in a way that forces the market to respond. That's not always the case with governments that often move much more slowly and based on other interests rather than the day-to-day realities of people. An example I personally love as a mother of two is LifeSpring Hospitals. This is a company in India that's created the largest chain of maternal healthcare clinics. So they did partner with the government to start this chain, but their goal was to really engage directly with customers and to give women a chance to voice their needs in accessing safe and dignified birth. They're reducing pressure on public hospitals, which often are riddled with corruption and create a substandard experience for low-income women. So by doing this, they're reducing pressure on the hospital, but they're also helping to change perceptions about what women can expect when it comes to childbirth. And again, this is to me what an inclusive capital model looks like. Finally, capitalism doesn't inherently intensify inequity and exploitation, but people in a both business setting or government setting can and often do. Governments can create tax policies and bureaucratic requirements that actually penalize the poor, can increase their own revenue while making it harder for low-income people to access critical goods and services. We've worked with a company called D-Light that has produced solar products that reached over 107 million people and have saved consumers $4.3 billion in energy-related expenses. They are trying to solve a gap that they see, and they've actually sometimes faced challenges with local governments that continue to subsidize kerosene because they are receiving revenue from the industry. We've seen governments that can create taxes on components that could help shift an economy towards renewable energy sources. So we see that both government and business practices need to intentionally prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable and the environment. And neither government nor business has a monopoly on social impact. One of the things that I keep hearing is that it's really for government to drive these policies. But I believe in a model where businesses not only follow the requirements of government regulation, but actually lead the way in demonstrating what is possible using business, and then work with government to force an even playing field so that they're not at a disadvantage when they're competing with more traditional capitalist counterparts. Inclusive capitalism, I think, can achieve things that government alone can't, and it represents an important shift away from purely profit-maximizing capitalism. We are seeing this every day. We're seeing businesses that are pushing and experimenting and trying to set new standards for the role that business can play in society. Markets and democratic institutions need to work together, but businesses and investors can do more than just follow the best practices. They can be the pioneers of new models, and we see the opportunity here in energy access, in food and agriculture, healthcare, and economic inclusion. It is not the norm today, but it is possible. We can make capitalism inclusive, and we can make it a force for good in the world. And if we can, we must. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmina. And Juan, that means we come to you last but not least. And Yasmina, and before her, Parag, set out there some convincing arguments, leveraging Acumen's own investees, some of those incredible use cases, but perhaps suggesting that our current system of capitalism is already creating value for all stakeholders and can perhaps just simply be tweaked to make it a little more inclusive. I believe, Juan, that perhaps you, like Lale, have been involved in some really innovative government approaches and perhaps believe that our current system of capitalism needs a little more than that and perhaps a much more radical reimagining. So, Juan, the final floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jessie, and thanks to the audience. I'll take an alternative approach to the question, trying to complement the view presented by Lale, with a combination of a more philosophical approach and some of the experience that we've had in the city of Buenos Aires. The first statement that I would like to make may be obvious, but I think it's very important and many times forgotten. An economic system should be oriented to respond to the needs, desires, and longings of human beings. Success should look like a global community of realized or fulfilled humans. But what does a fulfilled human looks like? It's kind of a tricky question, or a philosophical question, or a hard question. But I believe a good way to answer is to think what makes us human, what makes us unique, what are the features, the capacities that we have that makes us unique, and we should think of a system that expands those capacities. First of all, I think we are rational beings. We have the capacity and we are equipped with reason, and we could start a fire thousands of years ago, and then we could put a man on the moon with that capacity. Second of all, we are emotional. We have the capacity to mobilize and to be mobilized by others. Third, we are social, and our capacity to cooperate at large scales is probably what made us the dominant species of our world today. And finally, we are self-transcendent, or at least we try to be. There's more in us than in the context that we inhabit. We are finite beings with the capacity to think of the infinite, and we've spent thousands and thousands of years trying to achieve higher levels of consciousness. So if we want to think of a system that realizes and fulfills these capacities and then pushes them to their most important level, does capitalism achieve that? Does capitalism allows ordinary men and women to develop their full capacity to reason, to get emotional, and to emotionate others, to cooperate at a large scale, and finally to achieve some level of transcendence? And here comes my second statement. I believe capitalism is failing today, and in its present shape, it's not helping common men and women of our societies to achieve fulfillment. We have persistent poverty throughout the world, and even though capitalism helped to diminish that phenomena, it's still very, very important, and it has actually gotten better in the last 2 years. We have growing inequality, and the pandemic has increased that. We have a huge ecological crisis, and finally, we have the common men and women of most societies running behind the last model of whatever they want to buy instead of achieving highest levels of cooperation or even a high level of consciousness. So here's where I propose my third statement. I do need that we need to reshape profoundly capitalism, and I also believe that we need to reshape government, and we need to reimagine the institutions, both of the market and of representative democracies. And for this, I think we should take into account, first of all, we need to have a deep understanding of the needs, desires, and longings of the human being, and we should propose a system that approaches those needs in a holistic way. Second, I think we should put the human person in the center of the system, and the fulfillment of the human person and the average human person should be the only real profit that we think of, or at least always the first. And finally, I think that we need to take a profound decision to trust and empower the people again. And to finish, like I say, I wanted to share some of the things that we've done. But first, I would like to say that we have frameworks that tried to do this before in the world, and I think we should take into account some of those experiences. But I do believe that the framework that we should be thinking on today to actually reshape capitalism and reimagine also the representative democracies of the world is that of a radical democracy. We need to go deeper in our aim to give the power and the capacity back to the people. And what we tried to do in Buenos Aires was actually to democratize the housing market and to democratize the political institutions of the city. We worked in a very, very ambitious slum upgrading program. We actually hacked the institutional system in terms of the way political decisions were made, because I agree with Jasmine that government as it is today is not going to help many of the people that need to be helped. But if we were to reshape government institutions, I think we could achieve that. And like I said, we cracked the system. We created participatory roundtables in all the slums. We obligated us, the government, to go through those roundtables to take the decisions regarding the lives of these people. We built thousands of houses after asking these people how do they wanted the houses to look like, after working with them to design the houses, to design the new neighborhoods. We have in Villa 20 here in Buenos Aires, probably the first neighborhood entirely designed by the neighbors, and that includes not only the new houses that we built, but also the new shape that the old town, that the old neighborhood is going to have. So in order to finish my statement, what I would like to say is that I believe we should be asking some of the questions that were asked by the people that actually started capitalism. Adam Smith was not only an economist, he was a philosopher too. And some of the ideas that I'm sharing are not from Marx. Actually, they come from him too. And what I would like to see and what I would like to share with you is this idea of a radicalized democracy, of a democratization of the market, of a democratization of the political institutions. I think it's the way to go, at least to share some insights and to share some ideas, because I do believe that the present shape of both our political and our economical institutions are not enough to fulfill the dream that any system should have, and that is to enlarge the capacities and to make it possible for the common men of any society to fulfill their own projects, their own dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan, for very different but very compelling philosophical argument, and for a vision of an alternative model to inclusive capitalism as well. Yasmina, I'll quickly give you an opportunity just for a quick riposte to that vision that Juan set out, and then we'll move to audience Q&A.
Yeah, well, it's a privilege to debate Juan based on your very clear commitment to listening to voices unheard and the work that you've done. I think what you've said is compelling, as Jesse says, and you're talking about bringing humanity into the way that we design systems. And I think it's clear that, you know, capitalism has shortfallings and that it really puts capital at the center of the structure. So I guess what I would say is I feel like rather than sort of tossing out a system that has created so much value and opportunity for so much of the world's population, is there, in the same way that you've brought this human element to democracy and really sought to transform those institutions, can we do the same for capitalism? Can we humanize capitalism and put the achievement of the full potential of human beings at the center of an economic model that allows for private ownership and allows for entrepreneurship and investment to create value, but with human values and human potential at the center?
Okay, and I'm sure, Juan, you have some riposte there, but I think in the interest of time, I really want to make sure that we're able to respond to some questions that we have coming through from the audience. And Parag, I'm going to direct the first question to you, but of course, other speakers, if you feel you have a point to make, please jump in. One of the concepts of capitalism is obviously a focus on or belief in continued growth. And one of the questions that's come in is, do you feel growth is possible in the face of us clearly overstepping planetary boundaries? So interested in your thoughts on that question, Parag.
I would say yes, absolutely, but it has to, again, be done by design, not by default. So if you look at what happened after the 2008 global meltdown, Barack Obama, as president of the United States, gave the auto industry a bailout, but he had strings attached to it. You had to meet certain carbon emission requirements. In this time of COVID, European governments, including the government of France, have tied relief funds for businesses with sustainability metrics. So I actually think the two have to work in tandem. What we need is sustainable and inclusive capitalism by design.
Thank you, Parag. And there's a question come in, actually, Yasmina, that ties linked to your point, but I'd like kind of Juan for you to take this question. A question that's come in around, would you consider labor unions and worker-owned companies a form of inclusive capitalism, or a form of social democracy? What are your thoughts on that, Juan?
I mean, I believe that for sure we need to think of a system where more people can own their own destinies, and that involves being, in part at least, owner of a company, for example. So either we want to call it inclusive capitalism or a kind of social democracy advancing. I do believe that rethinking the way in which contracts are made, and even rethinking the concept of private property. I'm not against private property, but like Chesterton said, I would like private property for the poor. And that's what we don't have in many of the countries that we live on. And what I do believe is that we can actually think of alternative ways in which we could prepare contracts and consider someone an owner. And I do believe that we are pretty much obsolete in the way that we do contracts throughout the world. And I think there's a lot to innovate in that sense. And if we can link innovation, institutional innovation, for example, the renovation of many of the contracts that are made in several places, or the way in which a person is owner of something. For example, in Argentina, we have a huge problem with being owner of land. You need a thing called escritura, which is a paper that you need to pay a lot of money to get it. And it's crazy. I think we should go to a system where you can actually have a kind of blockchain system where you can be the owner of something. Those kind of innovations that apparently don't have nothing to do with capitalism and with socialism actually do have. And if we link innovation to actually socializing capital, I think, I mean, and that may sound like terrible, but let's put it, democratizing capital, give more capital to the poor. They know what to do with that. They will thrive if you give it to them. But now they don't have it, and capitalism is not giving it to them.
Thank you, Juan. And Lale, I'd like to direct a question to you, because you talked about in your arguments the view that the market alone cannot solve inclusion, and actually we need regulation and policy, we need governments to step up primarily. And so there's a question come in around, should capitalism be capped? In other words, is there a threshold for profitability or earnings beyond which further returns should be disincentivized? So interested for your thoughts on that, Lale.
I'm not sure we need to go that far. I do think, though, however, when, for example, companies petitioned the federal government last year for COVID relief, and they received COVID relief, those government funds ought to have been made conditional. They should have been made conditional on not letting the company spend them on stock buybacks, for example. So I do think there are ways that you can rein in some of the worst elements in capitalism. There are certainly tools that are very harmful, particularly to the poor and to people of color, like reverse mortgages, sometimes even day trading. And I do think it's, the market, we've talked a lot about different things, but the market doesn't invest in infrastructure. It doesn't provide equal access to capital. It doesn't compensate for work equally and fairly. And effectively, it doesn't really, we don't have that competitive a market. So we need policy and we need government to come in more fully. So I'm using this example of conditionality as one way, as one small way at least, to move forward.
Thank you, Lale. And Yasmina, I'd like to come to you, and clearly you've been arguing for inclusive capitalism. You do believe it's possible. You shared some examples of Acumen investees. But there's a question come in around, what are the factors that are most important in creating a more inclusive capitalism? Is it education, job training, housing, basic needs? I'd be interested for your thoughts on that. What is required? What are the factors required for a more inclusive form of capitalism?
Yeah, I love that question, because as I was thinking about this, there's actually quite a lot that's gone into talking about what do you need as preconditions to make democracy work. And there's a quote, I think maybe by George Bernard Shaw, but I'm not sure, but it says that the most noble work to do in a democracy is education, because it is what empowers democracy. An educated citizenry can really begin to shape a society as an electorate. I think to create an inclusive capitalism, education, and particularly a focus on moral leadership is just as important, because the way that we have taught people, particularly around economic principles and capitalism, is that self-interest is the only thing that you really need to think about. And it drives decisions and behaviors that continue to reinforce behaviors at every level that are focused on self-interest, when in fact we know that a thriving society is not driven exclusively by self-interest, but by a common interest. So I think that those preconditions of education, and not just facts and information that allow you to weigh decisions, but an actual moral ethos that people share, something that can be shared not only in formal education, but across our institutions and civil society and in families, that says, let's make decisions not only in how we vote, how we treat each other, but in what we buy and what we pay for and how we invest and how we redistribute wealth so that we can build an economy that works for everybody. So I do love that question. And I don't think that our basic system of education that promotes self-interest is actually leading us to a more inclusive economy.
Thank you, Priyanka. Yasmina. And Lale, I'd like just to come back to you as well, because there's a question come in around technology, and I know that that the work that you do centers a lot about technology. You talked explicitly around some of the technology companies driving inequality, but one of the questions that's come in is around are there new technologies like blockchain that could actually distribute ownership more effectively and actually drive more inclusion and equality? So a question to you around, can technology be a good thing?
Absolutely, technology can be a good thing. I mean, my only concern is that when we glamorize technology and all the tools of technology, we forget what role government played in making those things possible. So why are smartphones smart? They're smart because there was years of government investment in the R&D. The same with touch screens, the same with Siri. Elon Musk didn't develop Tesla all on his own dime. He actually developed it with funds from the Obama administration. The internet and DARPA, right? I mean, it came out of government often has a reason for solving problems, and it's that reason, that's where the purpose comes from. That's where the idea of, creating something amazing comes from. And sometimes, if it doesn't work out, you often create corollary things along the way. In the Apollo mission, for example, not everything may have worked out, but you ended up creating certain kinds of foods that you can use and that has other applications. You created certain kinds of, you figured out certain things about physics and so on that you wouldn't have otherwise learned. So I really hesitate to sort of glamorize technology in and of itself without thinking about where it actually came from. And that is that government usually has a very, very big role. And that includes the COVID, the situation, the COVID vaccines, which, as I mentioned, have something like $24 billion, the three major vaccines in R&D beneath them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lale. And before we move to closing statements, just very quickly, Parag, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to that question as well, because MasterCard is a technology company. Do you see technology as something that can actually drive equality and inclusion through a capitalist system?
Absolutely. And we often talk about technology should be something that doesn't happen to people, but rather happens for people. So when we think about the disruption to workers, both because of COVID, but even before that, because of automation, technology was creating the problem. Technology was making jobs obsolete. That same technology, the artificial intelligence, the data science, could be put in the hands of workers to help them identify what skills they need to get, connect them to training providers, and then ultimately get them placed in better jobs. Those are the kinds of investments we're making. And if I could, I'd just like to respond to an earlier point that Juan made. I believe in ownership. I also believe in profit sharing. I think that we need capitalism the way that Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, envisioned it when he was alive. When he built Walmart stores in my small town in Central Texas, every person who worked in the Walmart was a shareholder in the company. As the company profited, the workers profited. Fast forward 20 years later after his death, Walmart's a company that wasn't providing health insurance to its workers, was taking anti-union labor practices. Now, today, Walmart has seen the light. They're taking an active role in trying to help educate their workers, giving them low-cost access to a college education, and they're winning the race for bringing the best talent in. That is an example of how thoughtful capitalism is actually winning the day and creating profit sharing for all.
Thank you, Parag. And with that, we have so many fascinating questions coming in, but we're going to have to move because I want to make sure that all 4 speakers today have the opportunity to make their final closing statement before you, the audience, cast your final vote. So as a reminder, the motion that was debated today was there is no such thing as inclusive capitalism. Capitalism inherently intensifies inequity and exploitation. We'll start with the team arguing for the motion. Lale and Juan, please set out your closing statement.
Absolutely. So in the early days, we thought COVID was a great equalizer. We were all vulnerable to it. We were interdependent. Inclusive capitalism should have risen to the rescue and been our beacon of light, but instead limits of the market were deeply exposed. And in fact, the inequities were far worse than many imagined. Workers died in meatpacking plants as companies cut corners on safety and PPE. Death rates in communities of color exposed decades of inequity in healthcare, housing, and economic opportunity. At the same time, companies were lining up for government relief and lobbying hard against hazard pay and sick days for workers. And yet we don't have what we need, a people's vaccine. Despite all the public investment that underwrote those innovations, we don't know whether manufacturers will prioritize public health over profit and offer vaccines at cost. Yes, capitalists should strive to be inclusive and help solve problems, even if they retain much of their wealth. But if there's any doubt that we also need government policy to play a definitive role along with social pressure, just contrast the Biden and Trump administrations. In under 50 days, a Biden presidency brought us a pandemic rescue plan, and a jobs plan is in the works, and a families plan close behind. Policy matters, leadership matters. So there's no doubt we need non-market forces to solve our problems, to bring out the best in us and not just a race to the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you, Lale. Juan, please share your closing statement.
Thank you. And like I shared before, I do believe we need to rethink and reshape our institutions in general and capitalism in particular. And that reshape should go to the core of capitalism and put the human person and the average human person in that core. And like I said, I believe that a radicalized democracy, a democratized economy, and a democratized government is the way to go, and I believe we can do it. And there's many good things happening, like the ones that were shared, and I believe we should go on that direction with a deep democratization of the economy and of political institutions as well.
Thank you, Juan. And the team arguing against the motion, Parag and Yasmina, please set out your closing statements.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I have a frequent saying, if you want to go wide, go with government because they have the reach. If you want to go deep, go with NGOs and academic institutions because they have the expertise. If you want to go fast, go with the private sector because we have the resources to scale quickly. But if you want to go far, you must go together. I appreciate the invitation to join this debate. And as we wrap up, I want to share that in about an hour, I'm heading out to get my second dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. It's an emotional moment for me because it feels like the beginning of the end. But in reality, it's the end of the beginning of a new era of cooperation and collaboration across sectors and among nations. The vaccine I am taking is one of several that were produced by a combination of billions of dollars in government investments, the ingenuity of academics and scientists who worked at record speed, the rapid production by private industries, infrastructure supported by foundations and philanthropies like the one that I lead, and the critical legwork that's being done every day by community-based organizations and local leaders to advance uptake of the vaccine in hesitant communities. After the plague comes the Renaissance. I pray that as we awake from this fever dream of the past year, really the past half century, that we adopt thoughtful and cooperative approaches to building inclusive capitalism. We just have to choose it. I hope you will choose to vote for us.
Thank you, Parag. And as in my own closing comments, I have to say, following this group of people who are change leaders, but also poets and philosophers, this conversation has done so much, I think, to help elevate these important issues. But in the work that EY and Acumen are doing to talk about inclusive capitalism, I think it's highlighted how important it is that we look for certain qualities when we talk about inclusive capitalism that go way beyond the rhetoric, and the ability to stick the word inclusive or stakeholder in front of your business business model, that the work is deep and it's difficult. And I think that Lale and Juan have both helped us identify what are the behaviors that we need to look for if we are going to see shifts in the way that businesses and investing operate. Do businesses get in the way of regulation, or do they embrace regulation, knowing that it reflects the will of the people to create change and create more equality in the face of massive inequality? So for me, this has been a conversation, to Parag's point, about how these things can come together, but knowing how important market forces are in creating both opportunity and challenges, we think we have to bet on those systems, creating the change, driving them, but really leveraging the kind of experiences and insights that can come from every sector, and what we've seen in this conversation today. So just feeling deep gratitude that we have such great minds thinking about this and pushing for change that is so needed, both in capitalism and across institutions. And I hope we can continue the conversation in the Community Hub. Hopefully someone can tell a little bit more about how to get there, but we know there's so many questions and conversations, and I hope people will continue to join us for the discussion today.
Fantastic. And with that final statement, it is time to turn to the final important task at hand for the audience to cast their final vote. So having listened to the arguments today, do you, the audience, stand for the motion, or do you stand against it? Again, to vote, please go to slido.com in your browser or on your phone or in another window in your computer, and enter the code you see on your screen to cast your final vote. And while you're doing that, I'd just like to thank all of the speakers today for giving up their time, their energy, and their minds to make this debate so lively and insightful. Thank you to Acumen for continuing to collaborate with EY so closely, both in thought and in action, around these important topics. And I'd like to thank the Skoll Foundation and wider Skoll community for making this event possible. And of course, thank you to you, the audience, for showing up, for engaging with this debate, for challenging our speakers, and most importantly, for now deciding the outcome. And I can see it's still moving, but we definitely have a swing. I think we started out with 68% for the motion, and it's now looking as though it's pretty 50-50. So I'm going to give that as a win to Parag and Yasmina, who were arguing against the motion. And before we close out this session today, I wanted to highlight an action that you can all take in pursuit of the inclusive capitalist system that we clearly also desire. As Yasmina shared, at EY and Acumen, we've worked closely with businesses to create profitable models that do benefit low-income and marginalized people. And our purpose at EY is to build a better working world, and our ambition is to create long-term value for our clients, for our people, for society, and for the planet. One of the ways in which we achieve that ambition is through EY Ripples, our social impact program, which brings together the global EY network in an effort to achieve one shared vision to positively impact 1 billion lives by 2030, and extending EY services to incredible social entrepreneurs around the world who are role modeling using profit to drive purpose is a key part of that. And together, EY and Acumen have used that experience to develop this framework and the case studies to share learnings on the practical steps that you can all take to advance the inclusion of low-income and marginalized groups within your own business. The Inclusive Business Playbook will be available in the next few weeks. And I'd encourage you all to be some of the first to get that playbook delivered direct to your inbox by pre-registering at the sign-up link, which hopefully should be available to you in the chat. And with that, I'll say thank you again. I hope you found this debate interesting, challenging, thought-provoking, and I also hope that you find the Inclusive Business Playbook a valuable tool in your journey, in our shared journey towards a more inclusive economy. And as Yasmina shared, if you want to continue the conversation further in a more informal setting, then you're all welcome to join us and participate immediately after this in the Community Hub in the room of the World Economic Forum's COVID Response Alliance for Social Entrepreneurs, of which EY and Acumen are both members. Thank you to our debaters, congratulations to the winning team, and thank you to the audience. Goodbye.